Evan Hynes, co-founder and CEO of Climate Base. Welcome to the Epic Human Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here back in your home base of Berkeley.
Yes.
I understand you grew up around these parts.
I did. My dad worked for the city of Berkeley right around the corner. My mom works for the state doing genetic disease screening research, and she had an office on the other side of the block. So I am I feel like I'm very much at home here, even though I've never been to this office before. So
Good.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, pleasure to have you. Why don't we get started? You just tell us a little bit about Climate Base.
Yeah. So, Climate Base is a hiring platform and community for professionals and organizations focused on addressing climate change. We exist to answer a critical question that must be answered for the millions of people who would love to get paid to work on climate. And that question that we answer is, what organizations are working on climate and who's hiring?
I see. And how did you get into this business? What's the founding story?
Yeah, so I think it starts. I guess it depends on how far back we want to go. I would say the founding story would really begin with my own job search. So my background was in startups and technology. I worked in big tech for a number of years. I then transitioned into the startup space. Got really lucky and broke into like the early stage startup world. I joined this company called Make School. They were a education company that had just graduated Y Combinator when I approached them. And so, after 3 years at Make School and then a short stint doing some recruiting work for another startup after that, and then having taken off some time after both of those experiences to reflect on what do I really want to do next? What do I really care about as I think about this next chapter of my career? I realized that I just couldn't think of anything more important to dedicate my time and energy towards than climate change. And as a climate job seeker, just beginning to think about what that might look like for myself, what it might look like for me to transition into working in climate. Of course, I wanted to immediately know, well, who's hiring for someone that has the kind of, interesting, well, the variety of sort of backgrounds and skill sets that I have. And I found that process to be really challenging. Major hiring platforms like LinkedIn and Indeed and others just simply aren't good at answering that critical question, what orgs are working on climate and who's hiring? And my experience there, I noticed that I was not able to, finding these organizations on these platforms. One would think that you just type in a keyword like climate or something like that, and you'd be able to find all these organizations or at least their jobs, and that doesn't work well. You can find some, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg, and there's so many more organizations and so many more job opportunities at these organizations that are just not easily surfaceable, or like you could say discoverable on these very large platforms that are designed not for just climate companies, but really all organizations around the world. So I found that these platforms just don't work well from a search perspective. They don't really have enough curation to be able to solve this either with filters. And so that was like an immediate thing that stood out to me. And I started thinking like, well, I can't be the only person out there who would love to get paid to work on climate. But then, I started thinking a little bit more about it. And I realized too that, well, if it's hard for people who are mission driven and want to go all in on a climate career, if it's hard for those people, the mission driven talent, to identify where those jobs are, then what does that mean for the organizations? And how much of a bottleneck or really a missed opportunity is that for them when it comes to hiring? So again, at the time I was really just a climate job seeker. I hadn't really dove into thinking about this space from the perspective of a founder. And as a climate job seeker, that all this was in the back of my mind, right? As I was going through this beginning of this journey. I started putting together my own Airtable spreadsheet type of thing of listing out a bunch of different organizations that were working in climate. And I was having a really hard time classifying them. Around that time, I was, visiting my best friend from childhood, Matt, who's a regenerative ranching person, and he works in the regenerative ag and ranching space. And he was one of the people who got me really interested in thinking about this stuff in the first place. So I was visiting him and I was like, hey, I'm building out this spreadsheet and it's all these cool organizations. And I'm kind of struggling to sort of figure out, which organizations are actually working on climate and which ones maybe are working on things that are related, but maybe not directly so. And how do I classify them? And, we were having this kind of meta level conversation about all these orgs that are doing this kind of work. And he was like, oh, you might take a look at this. And he hands me this book. And, I'm in the middle of a field at a farm in Northern California. And, in a trailer, literally. And, so I'm flipping through the pages of this book in this trailer. That book is called Drawdown by Project Drawdown. And the book, for those who are not familiar with Project Drawdown's work, this book that they released in 2017 which was a New York Times bestseller that year, edited and sort of, I guess, authored in some ways by Paul Hawken, famous environmentalist in this space. The book reads like a directory of climate solutions. It's a coffee table style book, really beautiful imagery, really beautiful storytelling, and it classifies and sort of in its initial version, it ranked all the top 100 solutions to addressing climate change. And so I'm going through it. It's like sectors, energy, transportation, food and ag, and then all these different solutions across all these different sectors. And immediately I was like, this is that framework that I was missing. And I also wanted to, not only use that kind of framework in this catalog, in this giant spreadsheet of organizations that I was, building out. But it also, I wanted to, I was learning about climate solutions in Drawdown's work that I was just totally unfamiliar with. And I think until they released this report, many people, including myself, we knew that clean energy is a climate solution. And, and that other things like, electrifying transportation, these things help us decarbonize. But I didn't know that there was like a ton of stuff in there that I was just totally unfamiliar with. So I wanted to then, answer the question, well, what organizations are working across all of these really interesting sectors and solutions and who's hiring? Getting back to that core question that I was answering. Anyway, so that was all the background. I was building out the spreadsheet with my brother, Jesse, who's now one of my two co-founders. Jesse and Justin are my co-founders. And we thought, okay, well, maybe this spreadsheet that we're using for ourselves as job seekers, both of us wanted to work in this space, maybe this is useful to other people. Maybe we can prove that out and kind of create a hypothesis and test that hypothesis by organizing a climate job fair. And so I would say all of this stuff is background. The climate job fair is really where things, I would say, really picked up for us. And we knew that there was something here that was worth dedicating a lot more time towards. We had no emailing list. We had no website, no brand, but we were like, okay, well, we know these companies now. We've identified them. So let's reach out to them in the Bay Area and see who might want to be involved in a in-person job fair. What also got me really excited about this is about the idea of doing a climate job fair was that no one had ever done a climate job fair at the time. Keep in mind, this is mid 2019. So, we've known about climate change for, over 100 years now, I think, right? And I think 150 maybe now. I'm not. My climate history, I'm not a climate historian. Let me throw that out there, although I would like to be. I'm an aspiring one. So we were kind of shocked that according to the internet, at least no one had ever done this. No one had ever thought, okay, let's do a job fair, but for climate work. And so we were really thrilled about the idea of doing that and being the first to do it. So we put out the word. We got about 18 organizations to sign on board. Some of those organizations, I'll add, have now gone on to become some of the more notable startups in the space, such as WeaveGrid. Another one is Gradient. At the time, they were operating under a different name. They were still in the labs over at Cyclotron Road, which is now known as Activate.
Oh yeah.
And we also got Project Drawdown. Actually, we got Crystal Giselle from their team to actually come give a little keynote and presentation. So we were really excited, and we thought that this would be cool enough to get 200 people maybe to show up. To our surprise, that day, about 600 people showed up. And it was kind of the best problems you could have for a first-time event organizer that has no mailing list or brand or anything like that, had never done one of these ourselves before, right? We had too many people. And the vibes were hot and kind of like a little overwhelming. I mean, I can show you the photos if I haven't shown you them before, but like when you see the photos, people were literally shoulder to shoulder, in various places in this large space that we had rented in downtown San Francisco. If this was during COVID or the onset of COVID, it for sure would have been like a super spreader event. Like it was awesome. It was awesome in the sense that there were so many people who were eager to be there. We heard from job seekers that day that some folks had drove down from Southern Oregon to attend the event. Others had driven up from San Diego to attend the event. I mean, we did not expect that.
It was in San Francisco?
It was in San Francisco.
I see. Yeah.
I mean, that's a long drive. Like you have to be really motivated. And
Sure.
So that, the number of people there that day and hearing about, all the different people and what it took for them to all get there, that was definitely a light bulb moment for us. But I think what really did it was hearing from the organizations that were there. And, what they told us in so many words was this was the best hiring event they'd ever been to because they were finally reaching an audience of people, meeting a whole, community of people who were attending that day that were genuinely interested in the work that they're doing. Whereas at other hiring events that they had been to, they felt like they got sort of drowned out in the noise of all the other companies doing stuff. And also that the audience of people weren't there for a climate job. They were just there for any job. So you kind of get people who are like, oh, climate, sure, whatever. But you're hiring for sales. Great. Yeah, I can do that. Right. Yeah. And, these orgs want to get someone who's really mission driven. Right. So, when I asked them, of course, on the spot, when they were giving us this feedback and then, afterward in email, I was like, well, what's it like for you on the, online? What is your experience hiring online? Are those same challenges that you express that you have when you go to non-climate job fairs? Do you also feel like that applies to your experience hiring on platforms like LinkedIn and Indeed and others? And, all of them, of course, said yes. I mean, LinkedIn is for everyone. It's not for climate specifically. So it's the same kind of issues there, right? And that completely, that completely aligned with what my hypothesis, what I was hypothesizing around what these challenges for job seekers, how these challenges for job seekers translate over to being a challenge for the organizations doing this critical work of developing and scaling climate solutions in this unreasonably short amount of time that we have right now. And so that was the moment at which me and Jesse realized, okay, there's something here, and we need to pull on this thread further.
And so that was your early proof point of hey, there might be a demand here.
Yeah.
And I can tell you anecdotally, having been involved in the climate tech world for the last 15 years or so, I feel it as well. But I'm just curious, have you since that event, have you found third-party data of any sort that shows this general trend towards an interest in climate or any internal data in terms of the interest you've garnered?
Well, our own data, so starting there, our own data is always going to be skewed because it's the number of users that we've been able to attract. It's representative more of how well and effective we've been about putting ourselves out there and making ourselves known.
Right.
So our own data doesn't shine too much of a light on that. But when you look at studies from Pew Research puts out a huge amount of research and literature on climate anxiety, on desire for climate action, on willingness to change lifestyles. They've done an incredible amount of work on this, and a lot of universities study this topic as well. It's a really interesting topic. What the data shows is by generation over generation, concern around climate change and desire to take action, meaningful action in people's individuals' lives, that when you look at each generation, it increases dramatically. I think it's increasing by over 70% in terms of what you would see in the responses indicating that someone is highly climate concerned or willing to take action. And so when you look at the exact figures are escaping me right now. You need an assistant so that we can have them look up stats for us on the spot. That'd be wonderful.
Coming soon.
Yes. If you need someone, I might be able to help you with that.
Right.
Yeah. I bet you there's a lot of kids at UC Berkeley that would love to work on a climate podcast. Just saying.
Yeah, good point.
So, but at a high level, what you see today is that among millennials and Gen Z, it's over 50%. And this is like, removing any sort of bias or segmentation around political affiliation, right, within the United States. But within the United States, at least, over 50% of Gen Z, and I hope I'm getting this stat right, but I believe it's over 50% of Gen Z now self-identifies as highly alarmed when it comes to climate change, which is like the furthest on the spectrum. And I think it's something like 68% is highly alarmed or very concerned. And it's single digit numbers now at this point of Gen Z in the United States that doesn't think climate exists or it isn't a problem. So that's a dramatic shift from what we've seen with previous generations.
Sure.
But what's really interesting too is like when you look at, so now thinking about our own platform, right? Those are the trends for the youngest generations out there, right? And I'm sure Gen Alpha is going to be even higher of a concern level and desire for action. But when you look at the users on Clientbase so far, it doesn't follow that. It's not like we only have Gen Z. In fact, the majority of our users, where we actually have demographic info on this, the average years of experience is between 5 to 10 years or 15 years, depending on sort of how you create these segmented answers. But so at least with Clientbase, I think we're proving that there is a very significant portion of professionals out there that are either, that could be really early in their career, maybe straight out of college, but also looking at senior level professionals who have maybe made their money or maybe they haven't yet, but they're looking for some kind of impact and deeper purpose in their day-to-day lives that they're not going to get from just, choosing to get an electric car over a gas car. Or choosing to, maybe fly less, choosing to eat less or no red meat or other agricultural products that maybe aren't so good for the world. Don't get me wrong, all these things are good. We need all of it. But I think people intuitively understand that while all those things can be impactful, certainly at the aggregate, right? If everyone it's like voting, right? Then it really does matter when you think about it from that perspective. But as an individual, I think most people understand intuitively that nothing is going to be as impactful as them choosing to actually make this the focus of their career. Because how do we all spend most of our waking hours throughout our lives? Most of us spend that time working, right? So, it's like, if you're doing 8 hours a day, minimum, if you're at a startup, of work at an organization that's focused on climate, you're going to have a hell of a lot more impact from just that alone compared to like all of these behavioral changes that I think get a lot of attention, probably because there's a lot of marketing and dollar opportunity, from all the companies that are creating better consumer alternatives. But this topic of working on climate, I think is still sort of new in people's minds. I think if you asked people, a long time ago, what kind of people work in climate, they would say climate scientists and maybe reporters or professors or researchers. They probably wouldn't think business development professionals or software engineers,
right,
or marketing professionals or HR and recruiters, right? So, I think we're kind of and it's not like these opportunities didn't exist before Clientbase existed. Of course they did, but we've just been able to shine a light on those opportunities and provide this public good for people out there that are, maybe they've been thinking about this, or maybe they're just hearing about it for the first time, but people who are really intrigued by the idea of going all in on climate and actually getting paid to work on this challenge.
Right. I might have shared this story with you, but when I was like in my early 20s, I was living in Denver, and I was actually working, in energy performance contracting, and but I wanted more, right? I wanted to do more. I wanted to get involved with policy. So I actually called up the city of Denver because they had all these new climate initiatives. And I was like, hey, can I just come and help out a couple hours a week? And they were like, how'd you get our number? Like they were so confused. They were like, that's our job. Like, what are you doing? So I do recognize that like desire. So you started you started going down this path, you said in 2019. Things have changed a lot, right?
Yeah.
You had the pandemic, and then you have kind of this new slowdown. And for the first time, tech companies having layoffs. How has that affected, both the supply side, the employers, as well as the demand side, the job seekers?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, the pandemic shifted a lot of things for people and organizations. I think when the pandemic hit, there was a lot of uncertainty in the job market. And I think there, if I recall correctly, I believe there were also mass layoffs right in the beginning because companies were freaking out. They're like, hold on, this is going to, we got to become really lean as organizations in order to weather this storm. Supply chain and, all sorts of things were really messed up as a result and still are. And then of course there was crazy hiring booms right throughout the pandemic period. And so, that was the case for climate tech as well. I mean, a huge amount of the funding that these companies have gotten over the past couple of years came during the pandemic, right? Like a lot of climate tech companies were raising during the pandemic. And so the pandemic for employers created, for climate companies, there's, while there may have been in the beginning a bit of a pause or uncertainty around what the pandemic would mean, a lot of them just like went all out on hiring because they had just raised and they were growing and scaling their teams. What another really interesting factor is that many of them recognize that actually not only do they not really have a choice when it comes to potentially doing things remotely, but that if you're a climate company or even just a startup, you're going to have a big advantage if you can hire remote because you're going to be able to cast a much wider net and be able to get more people versus if you're looking for the same role but only for people who are willing and who are willing to work in person and are living in say I don't know like some random town outside of Boston, random example, right? But so that's like what we saw on the employer side. For job seekers, I think the pandemic was also a big shift in terms of a number of things that are related, very closely related to job seeking. So professional networking, developing your community, growing your community, building more connections with people is, about how it's roughly, depending on the industry, but across all industries, it's roughly represents about half of all hires are made through networks and professional connections. So a lot of people had no choice but to go online for those communities and for being able to build new professional connections. We've seen there was a lot of sort of renewed interest in ed tech companies that were coming up with novel, purely online experiences, to help people network and gain skills and be inspired. And so that was a really interesting thing that we saw, people more willing than ever to go online for community and education. And I also think that, and perhaps this is the most important thing I could have said, and I probably should have started with this. I think the pandemic fundamentally shifted the way that people think about their lives, particularly when it comes to work. The Great Resignation was the reflection of that. All these people who are employed, choosing to basically leave their job because they are just feeling like they're either not growing enough in their career with whatever company they were at, or they felt like the work that they were doing just wasn't inspiring to them anymore. And I think that makes sense. Like, I think if we, if I was at that point, I was already working on Climate Base, and we launched mid 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, as a website. But had I not been doing that, I think I would have come to the same conclusion that I want to work in climate as a result of COVID, because I think it would have done what it did for many people, which is kind of shake you to your foundations and you realize what is at your foundation. And I think, a fundamental need that people have in their lives is a sense of purpose. And we used to get that through religion. Well, there's less religious people today than ever before. We might have used to get it through political parties or other kinds of things like that. And I think people are, maybe feeling like a two-party system doesn't quite capture who they are in their individual selves and their own views. And so I think people are looking at causes such as climate change as an opportunity to to uncover and really kind of reclaim that sense of purpose that they may be missing. So, I think a lot of people, it was this really interesting sort of convergence of two main big, all these different factors, but two big ones being people wanting more meaning in their careers, or maybe just like shifting away from what they were doing for the past 10 years altogether, and therefore looking for new opportunities, being open to new opportunities, and all these climate companies having just raised and looking to scale their teams rapidly.
Absolutely. And there was $30 billion of growth capital that was raised in 2021 that was funding a lot of those, larger companies where they could double their employee base.
Yep.
So let me ask you this. I listened to an interview where you talked a little bit about the concept of greenwashing and purpose washing. To what extent are you do you and Climate Base need to be the arbiter of like what is a real climate company versus what is a pretend climate company? And how do you manage that challenge?
It's actually a really challenging challenge. We do feel like, so that is core to our value prop, to our users,
right,
job seekers, is that we are pre-curating, we are pre-filtering, we are pre-identifying these organizations so that they don't have to do what I did when I was climate job seeking, which is, look at all these random companies and try to make sense of who's doing what and which ones are climate, which ones aren't, right? So that responsibility does fall upon us as the nature of what we do. We try to, I would say one of the most valuable, I'm a really big fan of Drawdown. What the original team did and what the new team is, continuing to do now is that they're, and now actually when you look at the IPCC's latest report, they have a solutions. It's very, very much focused on solutions. And so, that I would say is kind of started with Project Drawdown, and now you see it reflected in the work of the IPCC and the UN. That kind of research we benefit from at Climate Base, because this is research that's saying, hey, this is what we need to do to decarbonize our economy. And so we can, go one step further and say, okay, well, here's the research and this is the roadmap. So what organizations are working on these things and who's hiring? It does get challenging though at times, because sometimes an organization might be working on, what's an example I can think of? This actually came up recently. An organization working on electric aviation, but their first product that they have in market is it's a plane, unmanned, fully electric, that is used primarily for agriculture and primarily for spraying pesticides and other kinds of things on crops. Now, I am not an agricultural expert, but I fully recognize that there are probably organic, alternatives to really horrible pesticides and other pesticides that use things like naturally occurring fungi as a way of mitigating insect damage and all the
spider venom.
Yeah,
all different sorts of iterations on that.
Totally. And there there's probably some companies on Climate Base. I think I've lost count at this point. I can't keep track of them all, but that are probably working on that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, but like on its surface level, if you're looking at their website, you might just see a plane. Their website is obviously designed for their customers, who are probably also using their product, not by necessity using damaging pesticides, but
right.
But many of their customers, I am sure, are using pesticides that you probably wouldn't want to consume or have your kids consume, right? And so that's one of those tricky things where it's like the fundamental technology that's being developed could be a valuable piece of this puzzle, the decarbonization puzzle, but maybe might not be used in a way that seems obviously good and obviously impactful. Mm-hmm. And what do you do in those situations? And this is part of the reason why we still talk to every organization that joins our platform. You can create a client base account, but you can't start posting jobs on client base until you've onboarded with one of our team members. And that onboarding, part of the many reasons we do that is because we also want to make sure that if there are any questions about an organization joining our platform, that we have the opportunity of talking with someone from their team and better understanding, get a better understanding of what those issues are and how they view, how they view whatever issue that might be. So that's one example. I mean, there's the other, I think, even more common thing is like, so the example I just talked about is like, what if an organization is developing some kind of technology that could be used in a way that is climate positive or not, right? And that's tricky. But I think what's even more challenging is when we consider emerging climate solutions, such as direct air capture and other forms of carbon removal. Where, I'm sure if you'll probably have a listener listening to this right now who's going to say he shouldn't even be using the term emerging climate solutions, because a climate solution is something that should be, provable that it works and also scalable, because we have to work within a time frame, a pretty narrow time frame here. So, what is a feasible climate solution? Well, I think there's another school of thought, which is there might be emerging climate solutions and technologies that are not readily scalable, but at some point we're going to need to scale them. And therefore, those organizations developing these kinds of methodologies, these technologies that they, just because their technology maybe isn't totally scalable or even scalable at all today, that it's not worth investing dollars and time into developing for the sake of the future. Mm-hmm. We used to feel a lot more hesitant about this. I feel like the conversation around some of this stuff, there's a lot more public discourse that was negative and highly critical of some of these emerging climate solutions, technological solutions primarily. And I think the narrative has changed a little bit recently, not necessarily because these companies have been able to prove that their technologies are scalable and readily deployable. But I think part of it is that the situation has gotten so dire that the science is clear that we do, for example, need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. We have to do it. Right. How we get there, we're not entirely sure. We know that nature-based solutions are a huge portion of that puzzle, 100%. We know that these things are, that we have scalable solutions today, but those alone aren't going to cover everything that we need to do. So I think that there's a certain open-mindedness now among perhaps some of the more climate purists of the world because of this recognition that things are so bad that we maybe should, if there's a willingness among investors to put money towards things like carbon removal technologies, that perhaps that is worth doing because we are not on the right path now anyway. Yeah,
I don't fully understand their argument in that, because everything is until it's proven and scaled, it's emerging and potentially scalable. So I don't fully understand. What I have seen is climate purists saying, well, carbon capture isn't the answer. The answer is really this, or having people having personal biases towards or against specific solutions. But that gets really tricky because we're all figuring it out. I mean, there could be a breakthrough in carbon capture technology that makes nuclear fusion obsolete, or vice versa. Right. So how do you call that?
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I'm a fan of like the all of the above kind of approach.
Yeah, I think it's about looking at the timeline. And I also, and I've heard this from a number of like climate luminaries and really big thought leaders in private conversations I've had with them, where, it's also this fear that the public is going to get distracted and the public is going to get confused about what the low hanging fruits are that we as a society should be paying attention to and investing in, which I would agree with them. I would not agree. Sorry, let me clarify. I would not agree with that concern. I think people are smarter than that. I think people can, hold two thoughts in their head at the same time. one, that we need to decarbonize by reducing emissions immediately. And that should be, if we had to choose between two things to work on, that should be the one. But that's not the case. We can walk and whistle at the same time. And I think that therefore people can understand that that is the case. And also that at some point we're going to have to develop breakthrough technologies, breakthrough solutions that are not yet readily scalable or even fully developed today, in the case of nuclear. But we're going to have to do at some point. And so we might as well get a jump start on that now. And I think a really good example of this is, the term climate tech. I've heard that term be used to describe all things in climate tech other than renewable energy like solar and wind. And it's always confusing to me because I'm pretty sure solar is a technology and it's climate beneficial. So, and if you look at the growth curve of how effective solar has been, and this is a moment right now, by the way, where I really wish our newsletter writer, Julian, was with us, because Julian Julian knows his stuff when it comes to this in a way that I don't, because I'm focused on a lot of things at Climate Base. But the growth curve of solar, of its efficacy as a climate solution, has been exponential. And if you asked if you asked advocates of solar in the 1950s and 60s, even the biggest advocate, the biggest dreamer back then, how big is this going to get? I don't think any of them would have predicted it to be as scalable and as cheap as it is today. So that argument that, this is not feasible in the future, this is not a real climate solution, or this isn't something that we should be paying attention to right now, to me seems a little bit short-sighted, because we don't know what the breakthrough tomorrow could be.
Yeah, exactly right. Tell me about the Climate-Based Fellows Fellowship.
Yeah. Well, that was a direct response to what we saw during the pandemic. I think there was, so a couple things happened leading up to the moment where we decided to explore this. Going way, way back, my background, again, I spent 3 years working in ed tech, and I learned a lot about cohort-based education. Granted, we were doing everything in person. So this is, kind of in a pre-Zoom being the norm that, this was before Zoom was like a normal way through which people learned. So I was coming into this already with the experience of, a community manager, of a marketer, of a salesperson, of a, when you're at a startup, you do all these things, right? Recruiter, and an educator, someone who was involved in an education business. And we knew intuitively when we were starting Climate Base that the opportunity to create programs that help people learn and build networks in this space, job seekers or even people already working in this space, we knew that there was something there. But, we couldn't have predicted the pandemic. So when the pandemic hit, and, again, we launched mid-pandemic. We launched in mid-2020, with a website. One of the things we noticed was that, again, people were going online for education, online for building networks, and that they were using Zoom as a medium. They were using things like Slack and other sort of communication platforms as an alternative to a community platform. And we were like, okay, well, we know that a lot of people get jobs through networking. We know that a lot of the people, because we survey our users, they create accounts, we ask them questions, right? So we know that a lot of people on Climate Base don't consider themselves to have a lot of climate expertise, but they're very mission driven. They want to learn, they want to network, they want to hear from leaders. And so we thought, okay, well, what if we created a program that helps fill that previously unmet need for community education and inspiration and the opportunity to work on projects and a bunch of other stuff that we bundle in. So I was actually talking with my old CEO from the education company I was at, and I was telling him like, yeah, I think there could be something here around this. What do you think? And he was like, I don't know, just spin up a page and say you're doing it and see how many people apply. And I was like, right, okay, yeah, that makes sense. We should probably do that. So we did that. Low risk kind of thing. Put it out there, make an announcement in our email, see what happens. In the first 6 days, we had over 1,000 people apply. And, again, coming from an education background, I will say I never saw that with any of the software engineering programs that we were doing at Make School. I never saw that kind of crazy inbound excitement and interest from an audience. And at that time, our user base was, I think we were hovering at around 10,000 monthly users. So like we had a really, relative, at the time I felt really awesome about that. That was, when you're just starting off, 10,000 people using your website each month, that's pretty cool. To put in contrast, today, in the last 30 days, we had nearly 250,000 people using Climate-Based. So, it's grown substantially in a relatively short amount of time. Mm-hmm. But to see that we got that interest was a signal that not only should we do it, but also that we probably should not be like half-assed in any way about how we set up and prepare for the program. That given the amount of interest, we cannot afford to do a small beta pilot thing that maybe goes well, maybe doesn't, that we know that this is something we should do and that we're going to treat this as a real endeavor, not an experiment. Mm-hmm. And so we spent literally the next year getting ready for that. We partnered with some amazing instructors that we work with who built out a full curriculum covering, on a week-to-week basis, each sector, diving deep into solutions, thinking through the lens of both technology and business and economics and politics, as well as climate justice and equity, and really built out like a full curriculum for a program. We also, put out the word to our network of organizations on our platform. We had hundreds of founders, investors, scientists, thought leaders, et cetera, other types of climate leaders, politicians, voluntarily fill out a form saying that they would like to be a speaker in our program. So we took the next year to get really serious about this. I brought on someone from my old, that I used to work with in my education days, that I'd worked with for 3 years. Jordan, incredible person, helps lead our fellowship program right now. Brought Jordan on the team because I knew I needed someone who really understood what it is that we're doing. And we launched the program with the first cohort in early 2022. Yeah. Time is weird in startup land. I'm like, has it been a year or has it been a day? I don't know. So about this time last year, we were starting our first cohort. In 2022, we ran 2 cohorts. The first one was 150. The second one was supposed to be 150. We accidentally accepted more people than that. It was 170 at the end, which is fine. But we've now to date we've had almost 5,000 people apply. So there's this huge interest. And right now, as we're looking at cohort 3, we're kind of thinking, okay, how can we scale this without losing the sense of intimacy and curation that we've been able to achieve in the first 2 cohorts, mm-hmm. which have earned a average score from our fellows of 92 out of 100, which is a remarkably high rated program, considering that this is a new thing. So it's been an incredible thing. And what we've seen from our fellows who come from all walks of life, some of them have many years of experience in climate, and they're already working in climate, and they're not even doing it as a job seeker. They're actually doing it because they just want to continue learning and continue growing their network. But we also have about roughly the other half of our fellows are doing it as climate job seekers. What we've seen is people use the program to not only launch into new careers, but even to start their own ventures. I was at an event in San Francisco. It was a startup showcase. I had no idea which startups were presenting. I walk in there. One of the startups that's presenting, they're doing an induction cook stove. The co-founder is one of our former fellows from most recent cohort. I was like, hey, what's up, Weldon? Good to see you. Like, wow, you're okay, amazing. And I think, granted, he had already been working on this, before joining the fellowship. But just seeing how that program was able to help accelerate him even as an entrepreneur in the space was really cool. And then another person at that same event, Kelson, who was a fellow, previously worked at Google and Microsoft and Dropbox. So like a pretty accomplished professional in software, no real experience in climate, was able to take his experience in the fellowship, not as a job seeker, but rather as a idea stage founder, and use it as a launch pad and a sandbox for him to kind of meet new people and test ideas and hypothesize something worth working on, which is it's called Carbon Gauge, and they have an API for basically making sense of all this really disparate data that large corporates have when it comes to their sustainability efforts. And it's an API that actually takes all this different kinds of data and it makes sense of it so that you don't need consultants to kind of like do all this data cleanup in order to make it workable for these companies like Watershed and other carbon accounting management platforms. So anyway, I'm getting really in the weeds on these two examples, but I bring them up to sort of highlight that the fellowship has not only been a success for us in our initial thinking of this will be a career accelerator for job seekers who want to break in, but also seeing that it's a valuable program for people who are already in the industry, either as operators and employees or even as founders.
Well, I can tell you, I met two of your fellows and
That's right.
at a similar event, and
it was the same event.
It was the same event.
Yeah.
And they were just raving about it. And, I wish I had it on film, and you should get it on film, because those kinds of testimonials, it was like, it was similar to how a freshman year student at college, would be acting, or a first year MBA, just like that excitement of being exposed to new ideas and meeting new interesting people and thinking about the future and thinking about how their career could change. Like it was like lightning in a bottle. So I think there's something there. Let me ask you this. What is SF Climate Week and how is Climate Base involved?
So in 2018, San Francisco hosted the Global Climate Action Summit. And this was an initiative from the previous governor. There was a huge amount of capital that went into it. One of the person on our team who's like really leading the SF Climate Week initiative, she was meeting with someone who was heavily involved in organizing the Climate Action Summit back in 2018. And I think we heard it was somewhere close to $100 million of direct capital, but also like sponsorships and all this kind of stuff that went into making that event happen. So it was a big event. Al Gore was there. It's a big deal. It was more of a conference. So, it wasn't like a distributed event series where anyone can get involved. It was definitely like a conference, something kind of similar to like, what the UN does with the COP, but, at a smaller scale, and much more focused on like, public commitments and thought leadership and really driving action and awareness and concern around climate. And I think everyone kind of thought that would just continue, that this was going to be a yearly staple that we can expect in San Francisco year over year. And of course that didn't happen. When we organized the world's first climate job fair in 2019, I was actually expecting it to happen around the same time. We started planning it thinking that the Global Climate Action Summit was going to happen around the same time. We were going to do this event while all these other events are also happening in the Bay Area, and that wasn't the case either. So then, the pandemic hit and all things in person basically shut down for like over 2 years. And so the opportunity of getting people together and building in-person connections and community was basically not there. Again, that's why we launched the fellowship, because there was a fundamental lack of that. And so, even back then, around the time we were launching in 2020 as a website, I had already wanted to do a SF Climate Week. And I was very inspired, of course, also not just from the Global Climate Action Summit, but I had already attended at that point New York Climate Week. I attended that for my first year in 2019, shortly after, a few months after we did the job fair, before we launched as a website. So, what New York Climate Week has done, which for those who are listening who don't know, New York Climate Week is in the fall. It's like a whole, it's probably, I don't even know, like hundreds of events in New York City, all happening during the same week, around which coincides with the UN General Assembly. That you have a lot of world leaders in town, all these people in finance in town. I mean, they're always in town in New York, but you have this converging of all these really important decision makers around the world for the UN General Assembly, and so organically there started happening all these climate events started happening over the past 10 years. And eventually an organization came in and said, hey, let's put a brand on this. Let's call it New York Climate Week. And that way we can elevate all the stuff that's happening and have a single calendar. So I've always wondered, why is it that there isn't something like this in the Bay Area? And that format, I think, is really beautiful and encapsulates, I think, how this work should be done. It's not a conference. SF Climate Week is intended to, in some ways, replicate what New York Climate Week does. But it's just like New York Climate Week. It's not a conference. It is really an opportunity for anyone who wants to get involved and do an event themselves to be able to do so. We have a single spreadsheet. No, we have a single calendar. At the time of recording right now, it is not live, but it will be live in the next couple of days. So if you're listening right now and it's before April 17th, you can go to sfclimateweek.org and you'll see a whole calendar of events that we have there. And that model of basically, putting a brand on this and saying, hey, this is a thing, that is what enables something to then be a thing. Of course, it takes a lot more than just spinning up a website and putting a brand on something. We also happen to have a very large audience of users, but also, I think what is the largest single network of climate companies and organizations that use our platform. Thousands of organizations now that we've been able to help with hiring. And so us putting out the word to all these organizations and saying, hey, mark your calendars, plan to do an event. You can add it to the calendar. I think it's already proven to be something that we have the ability to do at Climate Base. So I'm really excited. Yeah, it'll be April 17th to the 23rd. We expect probably somewhere between like 50 to 80 events. At the time of this recording, we've had now over 80 event submissions. Of course, hard to say how many of those will actually happen. But yeah, it's going to be a good one. And this is something that we are fully planning on doing year over year and building it. This is our first year. So the fact that we already have such strong signal the first year is really encouraging, and it's going to set us up to do this even bigger and even better next year and the year after and so on.
Exciting.
Yeah.
I'm pumped.
I'm excited too.
Let's talk a little bit about Evan. So you grew up in this area. I did not, so I don't know what that was like. Just tell me, like, what was growing up like for you? And we talked a little bit about your school and like just what do you think was different? What about your growing up kind of influenced you, and can you kind of draw lines to like where you ended up today?
Yeah. I'm from Berkeley. I'm looking outside the window over here, and that's Berkeley High School, and that's where my brother went to school. I did not, but Jesse and I and Justin, all three of us. So Jesse and I are brothers. Justin is our brother, but not part of our family.
From another mother.
Exactly. All three of us are from here in the Bay Area, East Bay to be specific. And I grew up in Berkeley, and I went to school in a redwood forest in this tiny, tiny community on the other side of the Oakland Hills called Canyon. So I went to Canyon Elementary. Very few of your listeners will know what I'm referring to. Most people have never heard of this place, but it's a really interesting place that I spent 9 years of my life, from kindergarten through 8th grade, Jesse too. It's a redwood forest. It's a town technically with its own zip code even, though the only thing that exists in this town, aside from a few homes, is a post office and a school, like a one-room post office and what is practically a 3-room K through 8 school. The entire school on a given year is around 50 students. When I was there, there was only about 5 or 6 students in my grade. So I had this really unique upbringing. Like, we had, during recess, we didn't go out and play, on a concrete schoolyard. There was a tiny little patch of concrete that was used for a basketball hoop, but most of, it was all dirt. And there's a stream that runs through Canyon School, like literally not through the building, but around the building, multiple bridges that go over it on the campus. I guess it's so small that even using the term like campus doesn't feel like it really captures how tiny this place is. I can't tell you how many forts I built. At the time I was going to school there, I don't know if this is still the case, unfortunately, but at the time I was going to school, there was a lot of, minnows, like little trout babies, I guess. I think that's what they are. Mm-hmm. We call them minnows. Mm-hmm. That lived in the stream. I could catch them with like I got really good at catching them. Probably shouldn't do that. I'm not condoning catching fish that are endangered potentially. But yeah, it was just like a kind of an unreal, surreal experience. I mean, fun fact about Canyon. Basically it was kind of like a hippie enclave after the 60s, where like some people who were like really still committed to living that lifestyle. There was a community of people that moved out there and populated that area. There was already a school, but there was a lot more people that moved in, I would say in the early and mid 70s. The Grateful Dead even played a show at Canyon School back in the day. So it's a different world out there. It's not Palo Alto. It's like the opposite of Palo Alto. It's something closer to like super, super deep NorCal, area. Very different kind of culture even out there too. Right. So that's I think that probably had a bit to do with kind of my own personal relationship with nature. We learned, we grew our own food. We had our own farm type of thing. Not a farm, like a garden. Thank you. Yeah. We grew our own food and we cooked our own meals, and it was a unique experience. We had a mycology course, so we had this like mycologist come in, and and we would go, and we'd spend like an hour every week or more. I think it was more like 2 or 3 hours. Like out in the redwood forest, picking and identifying mushrooms. We ate chanterelle mushrooms that were growing freely around the school. So it was totally different than I think what a lot of people experienced growing up. And definitely probably had a big impact.
Sure. And these days, at least, raising young kids, forest schools are big. Small class sizes are very big. More project-based learning.
Right.
So it sounds like the school was like ahead of its time in a lot of different ways.
I think it was ahead of its time for sure, but perhaps not intentionally so. I think that it's just that community, that very, very small, tight-knit community. I think it's just what they intuitively understood as being the right way to learn, that, for children, that they need to have access to nature, and that if they don't, they might be missing something. But I'll also just say that, like, at the time, when you're like in 7th grade or 8th grade and you only have like 5 students in your class, it's like, I was definitely, I sing praises now looking back, but like at 11, 12, 13, I was like dying to get out of there.
Sure.
I was like, okay, put me in a big school. I need to meet people ASAP because otherwise I'm going to get stuck here.
Yeah. No, I get that. And that is something that I have seen personally with like the small classroom size. Whereas it's intuitive that it would be better, but then when you realize like, okay, these 10 people or 5 people are my classmates for the next, 8 years. It's like sometimes you want a little bit more variety. So I appreciate that.
What about your kids?
So we had our son, our oldest son, in a very progressive private school, which had small classrooms, and it was really great. And then we wanted to move out of the city, so we moved to Marin, and we moved to more of a conventional classroom environment. Although they still have a garden, and it's still it's more in nature. It's beautiful, but we were worried that our kids were going to have trouble adapting, and they just slotted right in. They were fine. Right. And like I said, it's like the grass is always greener. Right? Yeah. You always think like, oh man. But sometimes, there are some benefits to a larger class size. There are some benefits to, a more conventional approach to education sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, socially, certainly, I think being exposed to a lot of people is really important. I was really introverted in high school. Like, I think it was probably because I went to school for perhaps maybe a little bit too long in an environment where there was such a small social scene. I mean, literally it was so small that they combined 3 grades at a time.
Right.
And you didn't actually shift, you didn't have a different teacher for different subjects. And even the curriculum on a year-to-year basis, because there was 3 students, like 6th, 7th, and 8th, right? And 3, 4, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade all together, K, first and second grade altogether, you know, in a given year, you'll be learning, like as a sixth grader, you might be learning what the eighth graders need to learn. And then they would shift it to the next topic the next year. Anyway, it
can be tricky.
It can be tricky. I'm curious also, like, do you talk to your kids about climate change?
It's a great question.
And if so, like, how do you have that conversation?
Let's take a 5-minute break.
Cool.
Apologies. Evan, great to have you here. Welcome to the Epic Human Podcast.
It's great to be here. It's awesome.
All right, so why don't you prompt me again on the kid stuff and because I thought about it, and then I can jump into some philosophy stuff.
Cool.
Does that work for you?
That sounds great.
Feel free.
You know, I'm curious. You have kids. How do you talk to your kids about climate change?
It's a good question, Evan. Surprisingly, it's they've been learning about it outside of my influence, even in the school environment. So my son last year, when he was in kindergarten, his end of the year school play was all about ocean pollution, right? So he
awesome.
was, a fish in the ocean, and they were learning all about plastic and the big Texas-sized garbage pile, like in the middle of the ocean and whatnot. So I found, I'm not sure if it's everywhere in the country, but I think in general, it's a major topic that kind of spans science and history and literature, and more recently we have a book that we got out from the library. It's like a National Geographic, on the future, and it goes through like, how are we going to power our cities? How are we going to take care of all this waste? How can we think about materials and that heal themselves, and how do we use technology to protect the environment and protect biodiversity? So it's been very organic. I mean, when I explain what I do to them, I try to simplify it in that I work with inventors, right? Cool. And I help support inventors who are creating really cool technologies and companies that are building the future. And sometimes it's esoteric and boring to them, but sometimes it's like, wow, like, I can simplify it and make it accessible for them, and they really enjoy it. So I think the other piece, to be honest with you, is because I'm passionate about climate tech and climate change, I want them to find their own thing, right? So I don't want to put that pressure on them of like, I'm solving a big problem. Like, why don't you care about it, right? Yeah. So, and that's kind of one of the tricky things about parenting, right? Is like, you want to introduce your kids to ideas and concepts and potential careers and hobbies and interests, but you don't want to put so much pressure on them that like they feel like they have to do that, or that if they're not good at that, or if they're not devoted to that they should feel bad in some way. Yeah. So that's kind of how I've approached it.
It seems like you're approaching it the right way. My parents were always very much encouraging of me to kind of, do whatever I'm drawn to. Not to say that my parents, raised me perfectly, although kudos to my parents, shout out to them. I think they did a great job. But I probably wasn't the easiest kid to raise at various points in my life. But they also paired that with, a lot of guidance too. If anything, more on like a principle, like a guidance around principles and values. And I think your kids are fortunate to have a dad who cares about things and has values that are, I think, important to society.
Well, I appreciate that. And it's tricky too, because, there's a lot of parents that put a lot of pressure on their kids and to either follow in their footsteps or to be good at a sport or a hobby or something that's important to them. And I'm just very conscious of that, because I saw a lot of friends kind of go down, weird paths and because of that kind of pressure. and I just feel like people have to find their own way, and it's really hard. Even in the best circumstances and best environment, it's hard to find your way in the world.
Yeah. I mean, especially now with, AI changing the game in a lot of ways. I mean, I think there are careers that as of 4 months ago seemed like really excellent things to pursue that I don't even know if people would say the same thing anymore. But there's a lot of, when it comes to climate, at least there is an seemingly endless amount of work that needs to get done. So if they do happen to gravitate towards an area that you are working in, then they may find that there's ample opportunities to carve out a climate career.
Right. Maybe they'll find their first internship on climate-based.
I certainly hope we are still just as relevant, or if not more relevant. And how old are your kids?
9.
Okay.
The oldest.
Got it. So, okay. So maybe in
in a decade.
Yeah. Like 12, 13 years.
Yeah.
So we got a lot of time to make a really excellent product for your kids. Perfect.
Appreciate that. Well, let's talk a little bit more about you and your personal philosophy. Is there a quote that comes to your mind often, whether in times of struggle or otherwise?
A quote that comes. I mean, gosh. I'm going to totally butcher the quote, and I don't remember who wrote it, but it's something that's been on my mind a lot recently, and so I don't even know if it is a real quote, but I'm quite sure that it probably is, and I'm going to embarrass myself for not remembering where it comes from and how it was said, but it's something along the lines of you can't build a better future if you don't think it's possible. I can't remember who said that.
That's okay.
Maybe I should
We can look it up.
I could. Okay.
I'll look it up for you.
Okay. All right. Cool.
What is it?
Let's just type in you
can't build a better future
if you don't think it's possible. I think it's something like better world, something like that.
It's possible.
I think that's it.
Okay, let's
find out who, because I've been saying this for a while to my team, and we were kind of going through like a branding sort of thing, thinking about SF Climate Week and what are the values that we want to associate with our brand, and optimism was one of them. And and I referenced this sort of what I think, again, I think it's a quote.
You may have coined it. I can't really
No, I definitely did not coin it. Someone else definitely has said something like that. I did not come up with this myself.
But what does it mean for you, like from a practical point of view? Like how have you used it?
So I think like when I was first dipping my toes in the climate space, thinking about it from my own career path perspective, right? Like, I've been growing up in Berkeley. I've known about climate change. I feel like for as long as I can remember, and I would say until very recently, until just the past couple of years, I think most of the conversation around climate change has been focused on climate change is real, and we have to convince the world that this is a real and imminent danger, and we have to take action immediately. But I think really starting in 2017 when Project Drawdown put out their first book publication, Paul Hawken and all that. I think that until then, the conversation hadn't really publicly, the public discourse around climate hadn't really been focused yet on solutions and like what is the actual path towards addressing this challenge. And so I think today, in 2023, 6 years after Drawdown put out their publication of their roadmap to reaching the point of drawdown and all the solutions that across all these different sectors that we have to scale rapidly. And of course, more recently, the IPCC report, their latest report has been very much focused on solutions. And so I think that with all this sort of new discussion and all these climate tech companies and other, clean energy companies and environmental orgs of all kinds that are now working on climate solutions. And, I think that there is still kind of this feeling of, okay, but, are we really going to be able to address climate change? And, unfortunately on Twitter and elsewhere, it's inevitable that you're going to come across the climate inactivists, the people, or even like the the naysayers who may not be saying that, oh, it isn't real. I mean, you can certainly find people out there on the internet who still think that this is all like a big Chinese conspiracy or a liberal hoax of some sort, which is, crazy, of course. But I think what's even more challenging in some ways to deal with are the people who are pessimists. And I just think like we don't have time for that. And I don't see pessimism skepticism is important, right? Being a healthy skeptic is critical. I mean, if you're a climate tech investor, your job is to be a skeptic, but you also need to be an optimist, right? And if you're an entrepreneur working in this space, you have to be an optimist. I think we need optimism across the board, from everyone working from advocacy to policy, climate technology to climate education. I think that we need to be talking about what is happening today in the world of climate solutions and celebrating the progress that's being made. Because again, we're not going to be able to build a better future if we don't even believe that that future is possible. If we think it's out of our reach, then we're not going to get the critical mass and sort of the critical level of action that we need across all these different areas to be able to actually reach that goal. So for me, when I think back when I was first getting involved in this space, what drove me into it was definitely climate anxiety and a really deep sense of dread and fear. This feeling of also powerlessness that, this is a huge challenge and it's out of my control and things are horrible and there's nothing I can do about it. Right. And that mindset is what initially got me into this space. But the only reason I'm able to continue to do this work every day is because I no longer have that way of thinking about it. There's plenty of reasons to be a pessimist, but I don't find that for me at an individual level to be particularly helpful in the same way that I don't find that mindset to be helpful when we think about, at a higher level, what's happening across this whole ecosystem of organizations and individuals working on climate. It's actually one of the reasons why I think the climate community is so vibrant and growing so rapidly and so exciting is because the community has a certain amount of optimism, that, a belief that there is a better world and that we have the opportunity as individuals and as society to be a part of making that happen.
Interesting. So there's kind of two different aspects of that. One is kind of the external, right, and dealing with pessimists and cynics. And I remember the same 10 years ago, maybe it was even more than that, 15 years ago, when I first started finding out and learning about this stuff. I was so excited. I would like go to high schools and colleges and just volunteer to like talk to people about climate change and energy efficiency and things like that. And the skepticism was there in full force for and there was a lot of, well, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my day to day? But then there was a lot of like, oh, well, climate change isn't even real, right? And that was a major debate, like less than 10 years ago,
right? Now, among the public,
right? Yeah, and it's less so now. Like we've kind of turned the page on that, thankfully, for like most, at least public discourse. But at some point, like I also tend to believe like you can't make everyone happy, right? You can't build a product, you can't create a message that appeals to everyone, right? So you kind of have to find those folks who are impassioned, and for the people who don't get it, it's like, okay, like we've got enough people here. And to your point, when that community gets together, it's like magic, right? Because everyone's singing from the same songbook and trading ideas and talking about the future. The second piece of what you're saying, I feel like it also is important in the context of entrepreneurship, in that there's a lot of negativity and people saying no, and people telling you you're not going to be successful. It's not going to work. What's the point of this? What's a climate job? Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So is that part of it for you too? In that like that believing kind of helps mitigate some of like any self-doubt or cynicism that you have personally?
I think you have to be a little bit you have to be the right amount, which involves a little, at least, of being unreasonably confident in your ability to execute on your vision. Because if you're doubting yourself, then how the hell are you going to recruit a co-founder? And how the hell are you going to, raise any capital, or more importantly, even like, how are you going to recruit a whole team? Right. So I think like, this is not to, promote, unwarranted confidence or arrogance, right? This is not about being arrogant or about being overly confident, but it's about having a belief in yourself that permeates beyond what you're telling yourself and allows you to communicate a vision that others can get behind. I remember when I was first getting started, I mean, literally, I want to say like nearly all of my friends basically told me that, in so many words, that maybe I shouldn't be pursuing this because, the idea of a climate job was really a new concept. I mean, sorry, I'm going to get in trouble with the climate scientists and the policy folks. When I say the idea of a new climate job, what I mean is like the idea that that a climate job does not mean like that a climate job is all the different kinds of jobs that you'll see being hired for at an organization, right? And all the different roles that people play at all kinds of different organizations, from environmental nonprofits to, policy and research and think tank organizations to climate technology, right? Like that, the idea of actually everyone has an opportunity, regardless of your background and skill set, to find a way of working in climate. That was a new concept. And so I think, I got a lot of pushback from, again, shout out to my parents. Mom, Dad, love you. And they're now like our biggest advocates. But in the beginning, to be honest, like there was some doubt because, it's like what I was envisioning was something really grand and large and scaled out, and really having a big impact. And, I think it's reasonable that a lot of my friends and family and, former colleagues would have doubt that this is something that I should spend the next many years of my life working on. But so how I got through that largely was ignoring that. And I mean, like, you take it for what it's worth, but you're also getting advice sometimes from people, who are going the safe route. And I think taking the safe route isn't usually that safe. I mean, sometimes it is, depending on what that route is, right? But it's, not everything is a sure bet, right? So, I've always, I don't know, but I'm also kind of the person where like I've always kind of just done my own thing, and and I've never really been overly concerned about if what I'm doing is what other people are doing. And so, that's an important quality, I think, to have as well, so that you can maintain a sense of optimism, even when people are telling you all the reasons why you shouldn't pursue something. So yeah, you gotta believe in yourself.
Right.
And when you do, I think that's the starting point from which you can convince others that this, idea is actually a good idea and that it's worth working on or worth investing in or worth, being a client of, right? So yeah.
It's funny you should bring that up. I feel like learning to not care what other people think is a superpower.
I agree.
In basically every facet of life. And one quote I think about often is, I'm going to do the same thing as you. I'm going to totally butcher it. It's something to the effect of, it's like comparison is, now I'm gonna butcher it. You know what I'm saying, right?
It's comparison is the like the enemy of joy, or it's like the stealer, the robber of
yes.
joy.
Yes, the thief of joy.
That's what it is.
The thief of joy.
There we go. See, we got that one.
Yeah,
we're 1 for 2.
We don't know who said it.
We don't know who said it. Yeah, well, you said it now. Yeah,
I said it.
We'll take credit.
Comparison
for these quotes.
is the thief of joy. That is so true.
Yeah,
that is so true.
Yeah.
And again, I'm just going to bring up my kids again. When my kids were little, not that I'm like they're perfect or anything or like whatever, but like when my kid or I'm a perfect parent at all. But when my kids were little, and we lived in San Francisco, I would take them down the street where we used to live in San Francisco, and we'd go from store to store and we'd carol for like the workers and whoever was in there.
Nice.
And then my son's in like kindergarten or first grade. He had to like tell a story about he had an assignment, and it was like, tell a story about when you were embarrassed.
Mm.
And he was like, Daddy, I'm not sure I've ever really been embarrassed. What is that? What is that exactly? And I was like, yes.
That's what's up.
Yeah.
I mean, like obviously getting feedback from people when, I mean, that's all valuable, but I think it's just like, how much weight do you put into what someone else thinks or what someone else feels or what they say? Being able to distinguish between like someone's perspective that you should care about and someone's that maybe you shouldn't care so much about. I personally don't think that listening to your friends for career advice is particularly valuable. I mean, maybe sometimes it is, but I feel like usually not, because you're talking to your peers and they're off on a different path than you are. And I think what's much more valuable is, kind of thinking about like, well, where do you really want to see yourself? What is your thing? What do you care about? What are you good at? What skills do you have? What are you good at? What do you love doing? I'm totally I'm just butchering everything today. Because the concept of ikigai, which I think we were talking about earlier. We've modified that ourselves a little bit at Climate Base for our own, purposes.
Well, explain what that is again, because I think you and I talked about it.
Okay.
But I'm not sure if we did it earlier.
Should we acknowledge in this recording that we are doing a part 2 of the same take?
Let's acknowledge that. Yeah.
So part 1, we got halfway through, and then our lovely host here wasn't feeling 100%, so we had to take a pause, and we've now reconvened for part 2.
Different outfit.
I am even less professional looking today. So ikigai is this Japanese concept that I think in some ways has been co-opted by the Western world for sort of career guidance. And what you typically see is that, ikigai is the rough translation for like your reason for being, or your reason for waking up in the morning. It's about finding your thing, to put it in like the most basic terms possible. And in a career sort of setting, you can think about it as what are you good at? What do you like doing? Which I feel like is usually similar, like not always, right? Like I like skateboarding, but I might not be that good at it, but like, right. But for like a lot of people in terms of like professional skills, oftentimes those two things have some overlap. So it's what are you good at? What do you like doing? What can you get paid to do? And then critically, the fourth piece here is what does the world need? And so the idea is that if you can find the intersection of those 4 areas, you have found your ikigai. So we think about this a lot. In fact, our logo at Climate Base is like 4 concentric circles, sort of overlapping, and not fully over. Well, you can look at our logo
to represent.
But 4
dimensions.
Exactly. Like why do we talk about this again? How do we get here? Kids.
Comparison, thief of joy. Well, it's because we were talking about other people's influence, and isn't it interesting that sometimes the people who love you the most will be the hardest to convince you should move forward with some new thing, right? Because they want you to be safe. They want you to not take risks in some, because they love you, right? But isn't that interesting? Like
but like exactly. Like I don't, I think it all comes from a place of love always. But it's important to not be like, okay, well, this is coming from a place of love, and it's coming from someone that I admire and I think is smart, and someone that has a vested interest in seeing me do well in life. So therefore, I need to listen to that person like fully. Right. So like take that for what it's worth, but you got to still think about like, well, what do you like doing, and what are you good at, right? Like you're going to know, well, actually sometimes other people will know what you're good at better than you will, but like no one's going to know what you like doing more than you. And, what do you care about, right? And what does the world need? I mean, that's a subjective, in some ways it's subjective, but there's so many issues in the world. And so being able to like have, really knowing for yourself what your ikigai is, what your reason for waking up in the morning is, and using that framework, I think, as a way of navigating your, not only perhaps your career path, but even your life path more broadly, is is a really powerful thing that doesn't necessarily involve getting the opinions of others about what they think you should be doing, right? This is a subjective, this is about your personal path.
Interesting. Sorry, I just have so many questions about this, but like, what is your view on taking risk and how one should think about when and how and under what circumstances they should take risk versus taking a safer path?
Well, I believe it was Thomas Jefferson that said, "You only live once." No, that's not it. But
how many misattributed quotes can we come up with today?
Let's just throw in more. Let's just total butcher the whole thing. No, I mean, for me, like, when I think about the people I admire, I don't think any of them are people that didn't take a huge amount of risk in their life. Right? Like, my favorite artists and my favorite people in business and my favorite political leaders. I mean, everyone I think are, at least for me, are people that have done something exceptional because they took on exceptional amounts of risk. Now, I also kind of want to acknowledge that, like, I think sometimes our society puts way too much emphasis actually on being exceptional. And like, our whole like values these days are very much around like, I mean, I was thinking to myself, I was listening to this other podcast the other day and I had this thought, it was like yesterday. And I was thinking to myself, like, what true power back in the day, I felt like, I mean, the balance of like between expertise and influence, and back in the day, I felt like expertise like lent itself more to like power and being able to like, have autonomy in your life. And I feel like today it's shifted almost more towards like, you're going to be more of an authority, even if you're not an expert, as long as you have influence, you have your audience and all that. So I want to acknowledge, like, I don't know if that's good for the world, right? Like, I think it's actually bad that we have people weighing in on like scientific issues who are like totally not scientists. I mean, weigh in on it, but like recognize that like if you're talking to an audience of 50 million people around the world, that like you do have some responsibility to bear. So, and I think that again, that goes back to like something that I don't think is good, which is around like being exceptional, and the way that we think about what being exceptional is today, I think is almost synonymous with like having influence, and having an audience and being known. And it's a lot of it is like ego driven. And so, as I go into answering your question, I want to just also acknowledge that like the idea of being exceptional is maybe not like super well aligned with the way I would prefer things to be today.
Okay.
But that said, like, I think when it comes to taking risk, you do have a limited amount of time. It's the one thing that money can't buy is time. And with that time, you get to live your life. And so you might as well do the things that, you would want to do. I think about it as, who is it? Is it Bill Gates who lives his life around the idea of like, it's like about mitigating disappointment later on. See, this is another quote that we're going to mess up.
Don't know this one.
It's about like optimizing your life so that you don't optimizing for minimal regret. Which is, it might be Bill Gates who said
okay.
that. I'm probably going to get this wrong.
Okay.
It was Joe said this. But like that really resonates with me. That concept of like, I think I would rather, be on my deathbed and look back at life and say, well, at least I tried.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, even if I didn't succeed, like, hey, at least I took my shot because I had this tiny, tiny little blip of time in the universe to do my thing. And I tried to do it. Right. That seems like a way better outcome than being on your deathbed and being filled with regret. Like, damn, like I always wanted to do this. And I never did because of fear, because of what people told me that I shouldn't bother with it. And it seemed like too much risk and I want to go the safe route, and again, like, sometimes it is the right thing to go the safe route. And sometimes it is totally okay to like not want to live an exceptional life and to, right. But just make sure that whatever you're doing, you're not going to feel regret about doing, right. That seems like the worst possible outcome.
Right. It's interesting. If you query folks who are retired on this subject, I think you'll get very different answers than folks when they're like mid-career.
Yeah, like honestly, like asking me seems like,
No,
I mean, I'm flattered, but like, what do I have?
No,
what do I know?
This is support what you're saying, because what I found it's interesting is just folks in my life who are, retired or recently retired. You go talk to them, I would go talk to them when I was talking about starting this firm. And even for folks around that age that have had more conservative careers, more safer paths or whatnot, it almost seems universally they're like, yeah, do it. Like, go for it. Like, and now's the time to do it. Take some risks. And
start that podcast.
Yeah, my mom's a great example of this, actually, because she's an interesting case, because she very early on in life had a extraordinary gift for art. Extraordinary, right? Just her hand drawings, her early artwork. We have hanging in her house. It's hanging everywhere, and but she was influenced by her parents who were immigrants, saying like, no, like no one makes money at art. Take a safe path. Go down the route of something else you're interested in, which is teaching. She ended up teaching preschool special ed for like 30 years, right? And which was another passion of hers, like young kids and education, and especially kids with learning challenges. But now that she's retired, she's getting back into art, and she's, her skill is like just insane. And she's kind of that same boat, in that she's like, well, very happy with her career. She accomplished a lot. She touched so many lives. But at the same time, she wonders, I think, what could have been if I had gone down that art path. And so I'm glad to see you, Joe, taking a chance and trying to build something and following your, higher, let's call it a higher risk, higher potential satisfaction path.
Yeah.
So it probably depends on where those folks are in their life and how they think about it.
Yeah, totally. I feel like I've never met anyone who regrets, pursuing a dream. But then again, maybe that's because maybe I don't surround myself with maybe my networks are not introducing me to like a bunch of people who have like utterly failed in their pursuit of their vision. I mean, I don't know. I mean, but I feel like it's not a linear path. It's not like you do it and then you're successful and then you get more. It's like, I feel like it's you take a step forward, you take a step to the side, maybe even take a step back before you can take a bigger leap,
Right.
And it can, it's an organic process of growth that doesn't necessarily just go one direction.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm definitely influenced also by my parents. They went, I would say, more conservative paths. Dad worked in city government here in Berkeley. My mom is works for the state, genetic disease scientist, program manager type person, leading the genetic disease newborn screening program. But, these are, there's no like, if you work for the government, whether it's city, state, or federal, you're not going to probably become like a millionaire, but like for them, at least, it was kind of, I think it was sort of going off the beaten path for them in their own careers by pursuing work that they felt like was, very much aligned with their values, right? Like that's why they did this work. And they could have gone into banking, and they could have gone into, like other, real estate or other career paths that could have been more lucrative. But my parents chose to do something that, really resonated with them at like more of a spiritual, intellectual values level. And so I've always been influenced by that as well. And my dad was an orphan. And so I think for him, just getting out of that system that he found himself in as a kid and getting into college and paying his way through college. And, that in itself is going off the beaten path from where he was coming from in upstate rural New York.
Right.
Where a lot of his peers were not pursuing that sort of professionalism path. Right. So taking risk is always going to look different for everyone.
Right. Everyone has different risk tolerance. and like a different spectrum of risk.
Yeah.
In terms of, and that's why, sometimes when I advise, college students or graduate students, I say everyone's risk tolerance is different.
Right.
Find where yours is, right? And I tell people to lean towards the more risky side of what you would do, but that doesn't mean you're going to found a company, right? Like that might not be anywhere on your spectrum, but it might be like, okay, am I going to work for a 100,000 person company or a 5,000 person company?
Or a 5-person company?
Well, what I'm saying is like a 5-person company might be way outside their risk tolerance, right? But maybe that's like the better
it's
spectrum for that.
You gotta assess where you're at in your life and what is risky and what isn't risky for you. For me at 28, I think, 28. Was it 28? Is that long ago? I'm 31. I'll be 32 in May. So 3 years ago. Yeah, 28, 29, somewhere around that. Starting Climate Base, I felt like it wasn't super risky because like I don't have a mortgage, I don't have kids. And I felt like, I have this like sweet little window right now where I can try this out. And I think timing is so important. Like your mom is now pursuing this passion, but that's because her kids are now parents themselves. And she's not worried about you the same way that she was presumably when you were like 13. And she's retired. And so she can actually do that now. My advice for younger people, especially kids coming out, I think oftentimes in the career space, right? Like I get a lot of people who are asking me career advice, which, on one hand, it's like, I'm happy to give it. On the other hand, it's like, I run a hiring platform. It's not like I'm a career coach, I know some things about this space for sure. And often within the climate work conversation with students that are thinking about, okay, I'm going to graduate. What am I going to do next? And I've heard this so many times. Should I go work for a big tech company and then go to a climate startup after, or should I go just straight into a climate startup? And it's a tough question. Like I don't have the answer to that. I think it very much depends on your own personal level of risk tolerance and how much guidance you need in a job. And do you do really well with structure, or are you more like you thrive in ambiguity? And also like your skill sets, right? Like there are certain skill sets where, you're always going to have a certain higher degree of job security than other skill sets, where, maybe getting the job is less about, do you have the functional skills, but maybe more about your ability to hustle and impress, and be influential in the way that you communicate and sell yourself to the company that you're interviewing with, right? So all those factors are important. But to young people in general, in case there's any young people watching this, I say, if you have the opportunity to jump into the thing that you really want to do, just do that. Because you never know, like where not doing that will take you. Next thing you know, you're on the straight and narrow, and it can be very hard to get off that path. I feel like I meet people in big tech all the time, been working at places like Netflix or Google or Amazon. It's really hard to walk away from those golden handcuffs, right? I mean, getting paid $300,000, $400,000 a year is to walk away from that and like go to work at a startup that can only pay you, less than half of that potentially. Well, not a lot of people are going to do that when presented with those options. So, in some ways I'm like, it'd be better to see people who are really talented and mission driven go straight into the area that they really care about, as opposed to going this more roundabout way that may never lead you back to that place you want to be.
It's actually worse than that because I give similar advice, but what my general rule of thumb here is if you want to do B, but you think you have to go from go to A first to get to B. My advice is always go as hard and fast as you can to B, because you might not even need to do A.
Right.
Like that's the misconception a lot of people have. Like, I need to do A before I do B. A, like so first off, that's their first presumption. This is a prerequisite to doing B. The second issue is people think, well, I'll do A for a while and it's safer, I'll make some money, and then I'll go to B. Here's the problem. you might not even like B.
Yeah.
Right. So to your point, it might take you forever to get over to B, which is its own problem. But the second problem is you might get to B and say, this isn't it either.
Yeah.
And it might be C, something I thought about a long time ago, but never even considered. Right. So I think there's a lot of benefits to just going straight at whatever you're most passionate about, because sometimes you find out it's not exactly what you thought it was.
What is your advice for people who are trying to figure out what they're passionate about?
Try. Oh, well, okay. So two part. One is first person research. So I always tell people, if you have 3 things you think you might want to do, go find 10 people who are doing that thing in each category and have a one-on-one conversation with them about what they do, what they like about it, what they don't like about it. If you have those 30 conversations, by the end of it, I guarantee you will be able to force rank those 3 things. Now, maybe 1 and 2 are close, right? So the natural next thing to do is, okay, I've done my research. My hypothesis is that A is better or B is better. I'm going to go do that for a little while, 3 year, a couple of years, what have you, to really experience it and get exposure. And if it's not what you thought, then go to the next thing. So I think most people kind of get that second step. They're like, okay, I'll try it. If I don't like it, I'll move on. But that first step is really key, because a lot of people don't have the chutzpah to actually reach out to people and say, like, listen, I'm interested in this. I don't know a lot about it. I just want to talk to you about it. I want to bend your ear about it. What they prefer to do is they go online and they do a lot of research and they read up on things and they read articles, but that's not as good as that human to human interaction where you can sit face to face to someone and you can say, that person feels that way about this industry or this function, and they're a lot like me in this way, right? Whereas I meet this other person and they're passionate about something different, but that doesn't feel like me, right? It feels like I thought I was interested in it, but I'm actually not.
Yeah. I had that experience.
Oh yeah?
So the weirdest job I've ever done, I worked in the music industry for a very, very short amount of time. I don't think we've ever talked about this. Maybe we have.
Maybe briefly, but go on.
So it was basically right before I got into climate, which led me to eventually start Climate Base. I was going through sort of a process of self-discovery, and it was, I had taken off some time and I traveled, which, by the way, is also something that I know it's cliche and I know it's super privileged and not everyone can do it. But like, if you're young and you have the opportunity to take off some time from work and travel, you should do it. And it's not good for the environment. I know all the critiques, but like, it's seeing the world and not having to be thinking about a job for at least a little bit of time, I think is a really wonderful way of like helping you free yourself of some of the constraints that you kind of artificially impose on yourself as a result of being in the career grind, right? So I wanted to do that. I did it. And I was, and as I was kind of going through that experience, I had this really random but exciting offer to go to LA and work at a recording studio, working for this guy, Sam, who has a music label, rap label, predominant rap and hip hop music. So it's an indie label with an independent recording studio. That was his business. And he hit me up and he was like, hey, I know that you mentioned to me a couple of years back that you're interested in maybe doing something in music. And I have this artist and he's going on tour with G-Eazy on their European tour. And I have this new artist named Guapdad 4000 that I need like someone to play point in LA and be at the studio and kind of like essentially like be his assistant more or less. Or perhaps, the better way of phrasing it was I was the assistant to the manager of the artist. Super low paying, but it paid something. And in the music industry, that's like a rarity. So I recognized that it was a pretty awesome opportunity. I was getting the kind of opportunity that like a lot of people would jump on. And I was like, okay, let's do it. And I'd never done anything like that before. And I tried that out. And what made me want to do that was I was thinking about, what do I care about? And I was making this, like, I think a critical mistake. I was not thinking about it from the ikigai kind of perspective. I was more just thinking like, well, what do I love? I love music. So I want to work in music. And what I found in doing that job was, one, working in the music industry it's brutal. It's living in LA and working in the music industry is also not only brutal, but it's crazy. Like oh my God, the stories I have are wild. And a lot of like really cool stories too. Late nights at the studio, like famous rappers showing up and recording at 4 a.m. And I mean, like cool life stories that I'll always cherish because it was just so out there and so cool to have experienced a little taste of that, despite having been a total outsider to all of that. But what I also found was that like, I don't know if like, I love music as a consumer. I used to play in a band. I still have fantasies about being a rapper one day, but we can talk about that later. But like that wasn't enough to make me want to like dedicate my life to it, at least for me, right? And for artists and for other people in the industry, I think for them it must be enough, right? That must be their thing. But I just realized like this wasn't really it for me. Because I'm like going to these parties and hanging out with these artists and some celebrities and like meanwhile in the back of my mind, like I'm still listening to like podcasts about like climate change, and I'm like, man, the world is fucked. Like, are we just going to be like partying while the world burns? And so like, all due respect to all the artists out there and everyone, where I work with are incredibly talented and super amazing and really inspiring. But for me, it was just not my thing.
What part of the Ikigai circles do you think was it not hitting?
So I think the world needs music. So I wouldn't say it's not what the world, like, that piece of it wasn't hitting for me, right? Like I think the world needs music. And I personally, I'm not like a hedonist, but like I do believe that the point of life is to enjoy it. And if you're not enjoying your life, you're not doing life the right way.
Okay.
Right. So like I don't think like we need to we like struggle is important and having challenge is incredibly important, and persevering through that is how you build your character. And that's where the best, I think I'll probably look back on my life and the best parts I'll probably point to were the most challenging parts, right? At least that's what I hope. But I think I was thinking about, maybe I was thinking about Ikigai at that time. And maybe that is how I landed on this. But the piece that when we take the Ikigai framework at Climate Base and we apply it to climate work, I modify the framework a little bit. And I change it from I change the piece, what does the world need? I help people drill into that by asking them, what are you most afraid of? Like, what are you really concerned about? Because if you're asking, what does the world need? Well, then you can find things that are really just another way of rephrasing what do you like or what do you love doing, right? Like, oh, well, the world needs, skateboarding. And I love skateboarding. Great, I found my Ikigai. Well, it's like, maybe it needs skateboarding, but is that gonna be enough to propel you and make sure that you have like a really, really satisfying, fulfilling career for the rest of your life? I don't know. I mean, I think that finding a problem area that you care about, something that really freaks you out, something that's keeping you up at night, something that like, when you think about like the challenges going on in the world right now, if you can find a way of aligning your work and your paycheck with addressing those challenges, I think that is where real fulfillment comes from. Because then you're no longer sitting on the sideline doing the thing that you might love doing, that maybe you're also good at doing, but like secretly harboring concern about what the future is going to look like. And like, I still have a lot of concern about what the future. I have enormous concern about climate change. So it's not like I'm fully alleviated of my concern and anxieties, but I do feel like I can go to bed at night and I feel like I'm doing my part. And I think that's an important thing. And you even see it with like artists and celebrities where they make it big in a field, but then they take on their cause area, right? Like Leonardo DiCaprio with the DiCaprio Foundation, right? Like what does he do that he cares about when he's not acting? He's doing documentaries about climate change, and that was another thing that really like got me excited about working in climate, was not Leonardo DiCaprio necessarily, but just realizing that like, yeah, I could pursue like something in the entertainment industry maybe, because I'm interested and I'm a fan. But like what I was noticing is like all these amazing artists and noteworthy people in music and in entertainment and movies, like they all have their causes that they care about. I mean, not all of them, but like, many of them have causes that they care about. And isn't it interesting that they gravitate, as their career progresses and as they get to perhaps a state of financial stability, and they're not as profit and fame motivated as perhaps they were when they were younger. Well, isn't it interesting that they all end up working on these causes? And what if I just went straight to that, right? Going back to what you were saying, like, why not just start with B, right? Why not just go with the thing that, you know that you're passionate about because you're concerned about. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm trying to tie it to another idea, because I went through something similar when I was in business school, because one of my big hobbies is like outdoor stuff. So like, skiing, running, biking, swimming,
right?
All surfing, all different sorts of stuff. And so like my favorite store to go into is REI, right? I just wander around REI for hours.
It's the best.
I just love it. And so I had this like moment of questioning myself in business school. I was like, wait a second, maybe I'm supposed to like work in this like outdoor equipment or apparel industry. So I went and got a independent project with Burton Snowboards, which was like one of my like dream companies to work for as a kid, teenager growing up snowboarding.
Yeah.
And I was successful. I got this project with them, and I talked my way into, an engagement, and we ended up working with them for about a semester. And by the end of it, it was a fine project, great people there I got to work with. But I kind of wrapped it up and I said, you know what? I'm perfectly happy keeping the whole outdoor sport world in my personal life and not working on it professionally.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And it might be similar like with music. So my point is, I wonder if there's something not only to, am I working on a problem, right? But also like, is there some benefit to separating, the personal and the professional somewhat?
I think so. And I think that, like, especially if the area of concern you have, or like, my short answer is, depending on what your interest, what the interest is that we're talking about, and who you are, and your ability to take on risk and all that stuff. Like it's sometimes, yes, I think is the answer, is that it sometimes is better to keep something as a hobby and not a job. I remember when I was an art student in college, I was a fine art student, painting, drawing, sculpture, all that. I started to feel a lot of anxiety around the idea of taking this thing that I love and making it my career, where it's no longer something that I do for pleasure as a way of unwinding or even stimulating myself mentally, right? Like, and instead it becoming a task and it becoming a to-do and something that I'm reliant on financially. And like, I think if you can figure out how to do that while maintaining a love for that thing, then that's pretty amazing. And that's why I wanted to pursue music, because it was another one of these sort of creative areas that I'm like really passionate about. And I was like, yeah, like I'm a fan, I'm a consumer. What if I were to work in this area, right? So, but for me at least, it wasn't enough. And I think I may have, I know people who work in the music industry, for example, who like can't, like they don't even want to go to concerts. They're just like, oh yeah, I'm good on that. Like I do this every day. Like I don't want to listen to music.
Right.
Can we put on something else? Right.
Right.
Like, can we put on some jazz? I listen to hip hop recordings all day long. Right. So like, I think you're right. Sometimes, for sure. Yeah.
It's personal. It's very personal. Everyone's got to find their own way through that maze. But it is counterintuitive to your earlier point that sometimes, what you're most like or are passionate about, that may not be the right path for you. And I do think it kind of ties to like, what does the world need somewhat, in that like need is not a binary, right? It's a spectrum, right?
Right.
And like the problem,
it's a hierarchy. Yeah. Maslow would argue.
Right. Right. But I guess what I'm trying to say, I mean, I know it's personal to every person, right? Like there might be a person that says, you know what? No, the world needs like music to get people through hard times and whatnot. But I think, to your earlier point, I think what is universally true about folks who are passionate about climate tech is that they share this common deep concern about the future and the need, and view the need as highly pressing and important and important and urgent.
Yeah.
Or urgently needing of solutions.
Absolutely critical. And you can't have art and creativity and snowboarding in a planet that is in political and social chaos, and there's mass water shortages and all kinds of crazy refugee crises happening as a result of the planet being 4 degrees Celsius hotter, right? Like so, yeah, that's the conclusion I landed on. Is like, what's more important for the world from my perspective? Is it for me music, or is it perhaps something to do with this big looming threat that I'm, that is not even a looming threat. It is here. It's happening now, that I'm really concerned about, climate change. And for me, I'm very so 2 thoughts. One, I'm very happy I got my way into climate. Super thrilled about what we're doing. I honestly, I think I have the coolest job in the world. I'm not going to lie. I think Climate Base is one of the coolest companies I can imagine myself ever working for. I am a business owner, but I think of myself as working for the company, right? Working for my team. But I'm also really happy I did try that other thing first. If anything, because, now I know.
Exactly.
Now I know. And so I think when you're younger, it's like one of the advantages you have is you have more time on your side, and you have, if you're 20 years old, you got at least 10 years, I think personally, you got at least 10 years to figure out what your thing is. And so you might as well try a bunch of stuff. But like be strategic, and what you're doing and how long you're going to let yourself try it before you decide if this is really the path for you. And I would say, start off, if you're someone who cares about doing work that aligns with like your values and your, and what the world needs, I would encourage you to think about the Ikigai framework, really zoom in on what does that world need piece. But I would also encourage you to think about that piece of it from the perspective of what are you most concerned about? Because again, think about my own experience. I do think the world needs music. I'm not concerned that there isn't enough music.
Right.
So I'm not going to bed at night because I'm like, oh, there's not enough good hip hop coming out. I mean, like, I'm sure there are people out there, and that is their concern.
Sure.
And props to them.
Right.
But it's a subjective thing. That's just not me.
It's subjective.
It's not what I'm thinking about when I'm going to bed. And for me, the thing that was keeping me up at night is the idea of what happens when it's not flooding in California. We have mass wildfires and there's no food and clean water to drink, and like that apocalyptic future is what that was the thing that was keeping me up at night. And that's why I chose to pursue climate as my Ikigai.
What about your most contrarian opinion?
Contrarian opinion? Oh man, I got a lot, but which ones am I willing to share on this show? Did we ever talk about climate jobs and what is a climate job? Was that a point of discussion that we had before?
No, I not on camera. So,
okay.
So maybe you can
right.
comment on that.
All right, I'm happy to share a thought on that. But also like starting off with like entrepreneurship thoughts. So like recently we've seen the startup funding landscape kind of go through some craziness. I mean, 2021 was ridiculous, the most frothy market in a long time. Everyone predicted that the froth was going to go away and that things were going to come back down to reality. And obviously venture capital is highly speculative, and so there's always going to be a certain amount of froth due to that speculation, right? Like, what's the next big thing? We're going to get ahead of the curve on this, invest money, right? So, but here we are now, and with the collapse of SVB and other banks and the startup funding landscape beginning to I don't want to say dry up. I think that's not really true at all. But like, just not as like, it's harder to get capital now than it was in 2021. My advice and I'm mentioning it I guess I'm bringing this up as like a controversial perspective, is that like the only thing that's better than raising venture capital as a startup founder is not having to. And I am a big fan of founders figuring out other ways of getting the capital that they need, especially in the early days when the alternative, right, is giving up a lot of your company at a big discount. And I feel like most of these startups I've seen fail have usually failed for a number of reasons, but almost always there is a moment where a startup has raised either too much and they've hired too much and they're like bloated and therefore their burn rate is too high, or they raise just at too high of a valuation. And then you get stuck. And I think like we're now seeing this with a lot of companies that raised in 2020 and 2021, where now the frothy market is coming back down, and the valuation of their company might be simply too high. So now they're looking at doing bridge rounds and even down rounds, or they're just shuttering the company because they don't have product market fit, and the investors are like, hey, listen, we like you, we think you're really smart, but like pursue something else, shut this one down, and they fold to that pressure. And sometimes maybe that's the right call to make. I think it would be better for the world if founders were more scrappy,
right?
And just figure it out. Like, I don't know, like make money. Like, sorry, that sounds really, I shouldn't say that.
I mean,
that's such a, but like,
no, it's clear. I mean,
Can I give you an example of what I mean?
Yeah, please.
Like, I don't mean to interrupt, but like,
no, okay.
I'm worried that someone's hearing me is like, just make money. It's like, oh yeah, easier said than done. But like an example of what I mean is like, before we even had a website, we organized the world's first job fair. Right. I told in part one of the recording of this, I shared that story. So,
yes, you did.
So hopefully the listeners have that context. And like we use that not only as a way of testing the waters of like, is there demand? Right? Will people show up? But also like, will companies show up? But then we were also like, will companies pay for this? Right? And so we actually generated about $10,000 on that first event by charging companies roughly $500 each to show up and have a table. Mm-hmm. And like, I can't tell you how important that $10,000 were. Like that lasted a very long time for us. Months. We let that capital last us months. And it was also critical because it gave us the confidence that there's actually a way for us to make money. And that, we don't even have a website up. We don't even have any audience. After the event, we had about 700, 800 people or so on a mailing list, I think, or it was more than that. It was like 1,000 people on the mailing list or so. But like, that's practically nothing. And like, I think in a different world, we could have, gone out, pitched an idea on the back of a napkin, given up 15 to 20% of our company for like a tiny amount of capital, and started building a website. And then, all these plans of launching and we could have potentially found out that like our entire approach was wrong or something like that. And we would have wasted all this time working on something that didn't actually turn into anything. And so I'm really happy and proud of the fact that, we just kind of were really scrappy. And proving to ourselves that we can make money was really important for creating optimism in the earliest of days when there was pretty much no reason to be optimistic about this as a good business idea. Like, aside from like my own, confidence that we'll figure it out, like there wasn't really any other reason to be confident that like climate-based would ever become a thing. So, I say this in response to your question, what's a controversial perspective? Because I do think that it is maybe not controversial, but I don't think it's something that most founders are thinking about. I think the media, the VC media sort of, world, tech media, right? The big headlines are like, if it's not a company shutting down, it's like a company raising a lot of money.
Right.
And so the world celebrates, like, I think a lot of founders have it in their idea that to be a successful founder, you have to raise venture capital. And don't get me wrong, we've raised some venture capital and we plan on raising more, but like do it on your terms, and do it when the timing is right. And and mix in some other financing options too. Like we work with Enduring Planet. They're wonderful partners, super thrilled. So shout out to Enduring Planet and Dimitri and that whole team. But they're doing non-dilutive capital. It's not something that it's not like a sexy thing that the media picks up on.
Right.
Like you're not going to see a story like, oh, Climate-Based does deal of X amount with Enduring Planet. That's not a headline.
That's
right?
like revenue-based financing.
Yeah, revenue-based financing.
Right.
And of course, you have to be making money in order to be able to unlock that. So it's it's something you got to work towards. And if you're privileged enough to get to that place, my advice is to do that and to mix that into your capital stack. In fact, during SF Climate Week, Enduring Planet is going to be doing a whole event in San Francisco focused on optimizing your capital stack for climate entrepreneurs, where they're going to be talking about venture capital is one option, but let's also talk about all these other options. So that's maybe not a controversial perspective, but
no, it is. It is. I would say it would have been a lot more controversial in the 2020, 2021 timeframe, because you are correct that the media / culture does reward people, at least optically, with they raised X million, a very large Series seed or a very large A from this brand name investor. And so that is a thing. Whereas like the company that just bootstraps its way for like 3 years and doesn't need to raise that capital is not going to get near any media or nearly as much media. I think in the past year, this position has become much more in vogue just because there's less capital floating around. And most VCs are focused more on their existing portfolio and helping them survive and helping them get through their high valuations that they, and grow into those high valuations.
Right.
But I think it kind of comes back to like one of the first tenets of building a company that is taught almost everywhere around like the MVP, the minimum viable product. And, I also tend to believe that every company has to find some sort of a hack to prove out product market fit before it's really real. Right. And oftentimes, in my view, that comes down to like coming up with a clever way to acquire customers cheaply.
Yeah.
Because acquiring them with Google ads or Facebook ads or whatnot, it's just, it's just going to be too expensive. It's not an efficient way to
unless it's a D2C
capital.
Unless it's like a D2C product of some sort. But even then, it's kind of
even
a race to
then,
the
I
bottom.
think even then, I think you need a hack.
Yeah.
Because incumbents are always going to have more capital to spend in those areas. So, but I think it's worth bringing up because a lot of founders do think, okay, if I start a company, I have to raise at this cadence, at these amounts, and those are good signals so I can hire the right kind of people, where that's not the only path, and it's increasingly becoming a less proven path right now, especially.
Yeah. And I just think it's good for the ecosystem in general for there to not be as much reliance on venture capital as like the go-to funding source. Like that should, if you're doing something that's scalable and you're doing hard things and you need upfront capital to work with, then VC is a great option. But if you're like pre-product market fit, I don't think you should be raising.
Well, this is also really helpful in the historical context of climate tech in general, right? So when I was doing climate investing 10 years ago, there was huge financing risk, right? And it was not easy to come by capital. A lot of the capital came from one of 5 firms and corporates and family offices. And so, but the good thing, to your point, is it forced climate tech founders to be really scrappy and resourceful and capital efficient. And so that's why I always say that the climate tech industry we have today is healthy and robust because of that hardship that they had to go through over the last 10 years. And so, when I talk about the IRA, having all of this positive benefit, I view that strictly as a tailwind. It's like we already have a healthy industry that doesn't need any of these benefits or regulations. But now that we have it, that's only going to accelerate what was already happening.
Right. Yep. Can I come with another hot take? Another controversial.
Do it.
So I think there's been a lot of talk around climate jobs, which I love, obviously. I've heard this phrase used, and I told myself I wasn't going to bring this up, but I feel like I need to. I need to.
Do it.
Which is like every job is a climate job is a phrase that I've been hearing a lot recently. Every job is a climate job, and like, look, I think that the idea behind it comes from like a really good place. It's like the idea behind it, I think, as I interpret it, because I can't take it literally because I don't agree with that literal statement. But as I understand the meaning behind it, I think it's about the idea that every person, regardless of what you're doing in your normal job, has an opportunity of bringing climate action and incorporating that into your work in some ways. It could be as simple as starting a recycling program or composting program at your office, or trying to encourage your colleagues to like track the amount of lights that you have on in rooms that are not being used, or I don't it could be like all kinds of little things, and I think that's really important. And I think incorporating climate action into your work is absolutely something that everyone can do in various ways and to varying degrees. And I don't think it's something that requires sacrifice. I think there are plenty of options that are, and championing people doing that is really good and important stuff. But I don't think every job is a climate job. And I don't think that just because you've started a composting program at your company means that you can now say that you work in climate. Like that doesn't, to me, that just doesn't make sense. Now, every functional role type could be applied to a climate organization. And if you're a software engineer, maybe at, I don't know, Amazon, and then you decide to go, or, let's see, we always talk about software engineers and marketers. Let's use like HR, right? If you're working HR at a large corporate, maybe a consultancy or something like that, and you decide, hey, I want to work in climate. And so you go to Climate Base and you set some job alerts after you create a profile for yourself. Make sure to upload your resume. And eventually you find an opportunity, hopefully quickly, to make that transition. Then you have a climate job, right? Like, okay, you are now working at an organization where that is the core product or service, and that is the mission. And that's what it's all about. That's very different, I think, than claiming you have a climate job because you've incorporated some sort of climate action into your place of work or within your company. And so, I say it's controversial only because there's been some like really big thought leaders out there over the past 2 years or so that have been like really making this a phrase. And I actually find it a little bit frustrating, only because like I think it's really important that we define what climate jobs are a little bit more narrowly, to be true to a definition that allows us to then really celebrate and champion all the amazing organizations and all the individuals at those organizations that are actually doing work in their day-to-day where, all of their work is all about, accelerating climate solutions or accelerating climate action in various ways. And it's not like a side thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so first off, I haven't heard that too much. And I think like, as we kind of alluded to in part one, I think it's because, we travel in different circles somewhat. And whereas I think sometimes you're in circles where people are telling like on maybe on the more environmental side of things and
activism, advocacy.
Yeah, exactly. Like just like more on that side. I tend to float in the circles that are more on the other side, which are like, yeah, we want to make money and what's this climate tech stuff, or like, how do we incorporate ESG and sustainability, but to the extent it doesn't hurt our returns.
Right.
So I think that has something to do with it.
Like super pragmatic, almost to the point of how are we going to ever create positive change on one side of that spectrum. And then on the other side, like perhaps overly idealistic.
Right. So I think that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is, I've when I was at a big corporate a long time ago, that can be an onboard to get into a climate job, right? To start doing some of these things on the side, and composting programs and energy efficiency programs, making sure all the lights are off and things like that. Like that's something that was a thing, a long time ago. It's probably still a thing.
It's totally a thing, and it's really important, right? Like
it's important.
Like I say this. Sorry, I know you're trying to.
Well, I guess just to finish my point, what I'm saying is, I think for some people that's enough.
Yeah.
And they're like, hey, like I'm helping out.
Yeah.
And and if they want to call it a climate job or not, like I don't care.
Yeah. I mean, like,
right?
Whatever you want to call
it.
But
But the other piece is maybe that's a nice onboard to say like, wow, this is like I'm really fulfilled by this, and I wish like my whole job was about addressing climate change.
Yep.
But and then the third piece is from your perspective, and I share this perspective, is if everything's a climate job, then what's a climate job?
Yeah, that's the whole thing that I've been saying. I'm like, wait, hold on, no. Like it's an inspiring catchphrase, totally. But like, I think what's better is maybe like everyone can work in climate, or like anyone can have a climate job, right? Like that's, I think, even more inspiring, honestly, because like every job is a climate job. It really does sound nice, but I just think it detracts from what I would describe as like real climate jobs, climate careers, people, the opportunity of it being the full focus of what you're doing. Look, and obviously I'm self-interested to like have a more defined definition around this because my entire company is about climate jobs. So obviously like I'm going to have, I'm going to want to say why I don't think every job is a climate job, because I'm trying to define what a climate job is as part of what we do at Climate Base. Right. And again, I'm going to end my controversial statement here with, and also incorporating climate action into your place of work. Not like, even if you don't work in climate at all, right? If your company is totally not really related to climate in a direct way, well, like every company has an opportunity of doing more on this. And therefore, every person working at every company has an opportunity of incorporating climate action or climate solutions into their place of work. And that is super, super important. It's critical that we do that. And let's do it without calling all of that a climate job.
How can people find out more about Climate Week? How can they find more about Climate Base and you?
Climatebase.org. That's the website. To summarize, we are we're the leading hiring platform in climate. We are rapidly expanding. I think we're kind of more recently, not out of our choice, but I think people have sort of begun perceiving us as like a climate tech job platform. But we are not just climate tech. We're climate way more broadly than that. We work with some of my favorite, and I would argue some of the most important climate nonprofits in the space, like Project Drawdown. Love their team, love what they do. Super supported to have helped them attract talent before, and many other orgs out there that are not just climate tech. Also, we are now expanding our audience and our user base to Europe. So if you're listening in from Europe, there are thousands of jobs now on Climate Base that are based in the EU and in the UK. And we have a fellowship program. I think I may have mentioned that earlier, but Climate Base, we are a hiring platform, but we also recognize the really important unmet need that many people who want to work in climate or even are already working in climate, an unmet need that they have for community and education to help them further expand their networks, further expand their knowledge base in climate literacy, and do so in a way that's like really powerful and transformative, and working on projects and meeting people that you would have never met otherwise from all different kinds of backgrounds. It's a very interdisciplinary community and educational experience. And we bring in honestly, some of the most important leaders in climate and climate innovation. We've had now over 500 founders and investors and thought leaders and professors request to be a speaker for our fellowship program. So it's a really fantastic program. Cohort 3 kicks off in May. I assume that by the time this podcast is out, that we will have potentially closed admissions, but if not, and you're intrigued, definitely head to climatebase.org/fellowship. You can read all about the program, and if we're still accepting applications, then I would encourage you to apply. Finally, we also do have one of the more popular newsletters in the space. I want to say our total mailing list in total is it's close to 100,000 now. Twice a week, we send our newsletter subscribers we send them our newsletter, and in that we cover some of the latest sort of developments and happenings within the climate space. We work with an incredible writer, actually a few writers, all of which are awesome. Julian writes our column This Week in Climate. It's like a long form sort of editorial piece on sort of looking at some of the biggest news stories of the week that was. And I don't think we do a good enough job of really promoting our own content and our own sort of reporting. So I'm choosing to use this moment now to encourage people to subscribe to our newsletter. I think it's really sweet because we also always serve up the latest jobs. And then finally, SF Climate Week is going to be lit, to use the vernacular of the youth, which I still identify with. But yeah, Climate Week is going to be awesome. SF Climate Week, that's April 17th to the 23rd. I think we actually need to change the date slightly. We're going to start on the 16th to the 23rd because we're going to be doing a kickoff event on the Sunday going into that week. It's sfclimateweek.org is the website. The calendar is there. There's already over 50 events that have already been added. I suspect that by the time the week finally comes around, which is in about a month from now, that we'll probably see somewhere between like 75 to maybe 80 events or so, 75, 80, 85, wow. Something like that. So it's going to be awesome. There's an incredible lineup of organizations. All the events are independently organized by participating organizations, which include a whole bunch of amazing climate tech companies, consultancies, investors. I just found out that Y Combinator wants to do an event, Lower Carbon Capital, Chris Saka's firm, they wanted to do an event. Initialized Capital, Gary Tan, his firm, they're going to be doing an event. So it's a lot of really great investors, some of which are climate and some of which are like looking to do more stuff in climate. And then incredible lineup of organizations that are doing stuff, community organizations, nonprofits. And we're looking forward to making this like an ongoing thing and run this year over year because the Bay Area deserves to have a climate week, I think. And we're humbled and excited to be spearheading this at Climate Base.
Amazing. Evan, thank you so much for coming here, not just once, but twice.
My pleasure.
And it was really a joy to have this conversation.
Likewise. Happy to come back. Maybe we need to start like a collaborative podcast where we just riff on stuff.
Maybe so. We could definitely go a lot longer.
Right. Is Garrett the editor?
Yeah.
Garrett, let's make that happen.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Evan.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Appreciate you.